Christmas at Grandma's house was always a spectacle, but this year, the air felt different, charged, almost electric, with a tension that buzzed beneath the surface of every polite greeting and forced smile. The living room was a patchwork of holiday chaos. Cousins shrieking over new toys, aunts fussing with platters of food, the scent of cinnamon and pine needles mingling with the sharper tang of old resentments. I stood near the window, watching snowflakes drift past the frosted glass, feeling as much an outsider as ever, even in the heart of my own family. Grandma, in her usual fashion, had gone all out. The tree was a towering monument to Christmas excess, every branch sagging under the weight of ornaments collected over decades. She wore her favorite red sweater, the one with the sequined reindeer, and a mischievous glint in her eye that I'd come to recognize as the prelude to some kind of spectacle. I caught her gaze across the room, and she winked at me, as if we shared a secret no one else could see. After dinner, when the last of the pie had been scraped from the plates and the kids had retreated to the basement to play, Grandma called everyone into the living room. Her voice, though softened by age, still carried authority. "Before you all run off," she said, "I have a little something for each of you." She produced a stack of envelopes from her purse, each one thick and sealed with a gold sticker. She handed them out, one by one, her hands trembling only slightly. I watched as my parents, my aunts and uncles, my cousins, everyone, received their envelope with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. When she reached me, she pressed the envelope into my palm and held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. There was something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite name. We all stood there, clutching our envelopes, the room suddenly hushed. Grandma nodded. "Go on, open them." The sound of tearing paper filled the room, followed by a collective gasp. Inside each envelope was a check, each one made out for $5 million. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, as if on cue, laughter erupted. My cousin Mark was the first to break the spell, waving his check in the air. "Nice one, Grandma. What's next? A deed to Buckingham Palace." My mother snorted, shaking her head. "She's really outdone herself this year." Monopoly money would have been more believable. The jokes flew fast and sharp, each one a little dagger. "Maybe she won the lottery and forgot to tell us," someone quipped. "Or maybe she's finally lost it," another whispered, not quite quietly enough. I looked down at my own check, the numbers blurring for a moment. $5 million. My name, written in Grandma's careful script. The bank's logo, crisp and official. It looked real, too real. My heart thudded in my chest, a strange mix of hope and embarrassment rising in my throat. I glanced at Grandma, who was watching the room with a small, enigmatic smile. No one took it seriously. The checks were tossed onto coffee tables, tucked into purses, or waved around as props for more jokes. I felt the familiar sting of being on the outside, of wanting to believe in something more, even as everyone else dismissed it as a joke. I remembered all the times I'd been the only one to take Grandma seriously, the only one to listen to her stories or help her in the garden. Maybe that was why, as the laughter died down and the family drifted back into their cliques, I slipped my check into my pocket instead of leaving it behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a holiday prank. Grandma's eyes found mine again, and for a split second, I saw something fierce and proud in her expression, a challenge, maybe, or a plea. I pressed the check between my fingers, feeling the weight of possibility. I never imagined that one piece of paper would change everything. Strange how a single moment can pull you backward through time, unraveling years of memories you thought you'd packed away for good. As I stood in Grandma's living room, the laughter and disbelief swirling around me, I was suddenly a child again, small, hopeful, and desperate to belong. My earliest memories of family gatherings are a blur of noise and color, but the feelings are sharp as ever. I remember clinging to the edge of the crowd, watching my cousins tumble across the lawn in a tangle of limbs and laughter. Mark, the oldest, was always the ringleader, his voice booming as he organized games and doled out roles. I was never picked first. Sometimes, I wasn't picked at all. I'd stand there, hands balled into fists, pretending not to care as the teams formed without me. Inside, the adults would gather around the kitchen table, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm I could never quite follow. My mother, always impeccably dressed, would lean in close to my aunt, their heads bent together in whispered conversation. My father, quieter but no less present, would nod along, his eyes flicking over me with a kind of distracted affection. I learned early on that my place was on the periphery, close enough to hear, never close enough to be heard. It wasn't that my family was cruel, exactly. It was more subtle than that, 1,000 tiny slights, a pattern of being overlooked that became as familiar as my own shadow. When report cards came home, my achievements were met with polite nods, while Mark's soccer trophies earned him a standing ovation. When I brought Grandma a bouquet of wildflowers I'd picked myself, my mother scolded me for tracking mud into the house, while my cousin's store-bought chocolates were praised as thoughtful and mature. I remember one Christmas in particular, years before the checks, when Grandma gave each of us a small, wrapped box. Inside mine was a silver locket, delicate and old-fashioned. I opened it to find a tiny photograph of her as a young woman, smiling shyly at the camera. "For you, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft. "So you'll always remember you're special." I wore that locket every day for a week, until my cousin Sarah teased me for being Grandma's little pet. After that, I tucked it away in my drawer, too embarrassed to wear it but unable to throw it out. The older I got, the more I noticed the way the family revolved around certain people. Mark, with his easy charm and endless confidence, was the golden child. Sarah, clever and quick-witted, could do no wrong in my aunt's eyes. Even the adults had their favorites, alliances that shifted with the seasons, but always left me on the outside looking in. I tried to earn my place, to be helpful and agreeable, but it never seemed to matter. My accomplishments were invisible, my opinions dismissed with a wave of the hand. I learned to keep my head down, to listen more than I spoke. Humility became my armor, a way to protect myself from the sting of disappointment. I watched as my cousins demanded attention, their voices loud and insistent, their needs always met first. They moved through the world with a sense of entitlement I couldn't understand, as if the universe owed them something simply for existing. I envied their confidence, even as I resented it. At school, I found solace in books and quiet corners. I became the friend people confided in, the one who listened without judgment. I told myself I didn't need the spotlight, that I was content to be the steady presence in the background. But deep down, I longed for someone to notice me, to see me, really see me, and say that I mattered. Grandma was the only one who seemed to understand. She'd pull me aside during family gatherings, her hands warm and steady on my shoulders. "You have a good heart," she'd whisper. "Don't let them make you doubt it." She'd tell me stories about her own childhood, about growing up poor and learning to make do with what she had. She taught me how to plant tomatoes in her garden, how to bake bread from scratch, how to find beauty in small, ordinary things. With her, I felt seen in a way I never did with the rest of the family. But even Grandma's affection couldn't shield me from the ache of being left out. I remember the year Mark got a new bike for his birthday, a gleaming red Schwinn with silver handlebars. The whole family gathered in the driveway to watch him ride it for the first time, cheering as he pedaled in circles. I stood on the porch, clutching the book I'd brought as a gift, feeling invisible. Later, when I asked my mother why Mark always seemed to get the best presents, she shrugged. "He's the oldest. He deserves it." That was the refrain of my childhood, "He deserves it. She needs it more. You're so easy, you never complain." I learned to swallow my disappointment, to tell myself that being overlooked was a kind of strength. But the truth was, it hurt. It hurt every time I was passed over, every time my efforts went unnoticed, every time I was reminded that I was, at best, an afterthought. As I grew older, the patterns only deepened. My cousins went off to college, their tuition paid without question, while I worked part-time jobs to cover my expenses. Family gatherings became less frequent, but the dynamics never changed. I was still the outsider, still the one on the edge of every conversation, still the one whose presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. Standing in Grandma's living room that Christmas, surrounded by laughter and disbelief, I felt the weight of all those years pressing down on me. The cynicism in the room was thick enough to choke on, every joke about the checks a reminder of how little anyone expected from Grandma, or from me. But beneath the cynicism, I felt a flicker of something else. Hope. The same hope I'd carried with me since childhood, stubborn and persistent, refusing to be snuffed out. Maybe that was why I couldn't laugh off the check the way everyone else did. Maybe that was why I slipped it into my pocket, holding on to the possibility that, for once, things might be different. For once, I might be more than just the outsider. For once, I might matter. The laughter didn't die down quickly. If anything, it grew louder, echoing off the walls and filling every corner of Grandma's living room. My Uncle Dave, always the loudest voice in the room, held his check up to the light and squinted at it, as if expecting to see "Void" stamped across the front in invisible ink. "Well, I guess I can finally pay off that yacht I never bought," he announced, grinning at his own joke. The others joined in, each trying to outdo the last with their mockery. Sarah, my cousin, fanned herself with her check and adopted a dramatic, swooning voice. "Oh, Grandma, you shouldn't have. I mean, really, you shouldn't have. My heart can't take this kind of excitement." She collapsed onto the couch, giggling, and the room erupted again. Even my mother, who usually tried to keep up appearances, couldn't resist. She leaned over to my aunt and whispered, "She's always been a dreamer, hasn't she? Remember the year she gave us all those magic beans for good luck?" They both laughed, the sound sharp and familiar, a private joke I was never meant to be part of. I stood on the edge of the group, my check pressed between my fingers, trying to disappear into the wallpaper. The humiliation burned in my chest, hot and raw. I wanted to say something, to defend Grandma, but the words caught in my throat. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to join in, to laugh at the absurdity of it all. But I couldn't. Not this time. Mark, always the showman, strutted around the room, waving his check like a flag. "I'm going to frame this and hang it in my office, right next to my diploma. Maybe it'll bring me some of that imaginary luck Grandma's always talking about." He caught my eye and winked, as if we were in on the joke together. But I wasn't laughing. The more they joked, the more isolated I felt. It was as if the room had shrunk, the walls closing in around me, pushing me further and further to the margins. I watched Grandma, sitting quietly in her armchair, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't seem hurt by the laughter, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a flicker of something I recognized all too well. She met my gaze for a moment, and I saw a silent question there. "Do you believe in me?" I wanted to answer her, to tell her that I did, that I always had. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked down at the check in my hand, tracing the edges with my thumb. It felt real, thicker than the cheap paper you'd expect from a prank, the ink crisp and dark. My name was spelled perfectly, every letter in Grandma's careful handwriting. I wondered how long she'd spent preparing these, how much thought she'd put into this moment, only to have it dismissed as a joke. The jokes kept coming, each one sharper than the last. "Maybe she's got a secret oil well in the backyard," someone said. "Or maybe she's been running a Ponzi scheme with the church bake sale money." The laughter was relentless, a wave that threatened to sweep me away. I tried to remind myself that this was nothing new. I'd spent my whole life on the outside, watching as my family closed ranks around their own stories, their own truths. I'd learned to swallow my pride, to let their words wash over me without leaving a mark. But tonight, something was different. The humiliation stung, but beneath it, I felt a spark of something else, something stubborn and unyielding. I remembered all the times Grandma had told me to trust my instincts, to look beyond the surface of things. "People see what they want to see," she'd say, her voice low and steady. "But you see what's really there." I wondered if that was what she was counting on now, if she'd given me this check not as a joke, but as a test. The room began to empty as people drifted off to the kitchen for dessert or gathered their things to leave. The checks were abandoned on coffee tables, stuffed into coat pockets, or left behind entirely. No one seemed to care. No one, except me. I slipped my check into my pocket, feeling its weight against my leg. I could hear the laughter fading as I made my way to the hallway, but it echoed in my mind, a reminder of every time I'd been dismissed, every time I'd been told I was too naive, too trusting, too willing to believe in things no one else could see. But this time, I wasn't going to let it go. This time, I was going to find out the truth, no matter how ridiculous it seemed. Maybe it was foolish, maybe I was setting myself up for disappointment, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut, the sense that there was more to this than anyone realized. As I stood in the hallway, listening to the muffled sounds of my family's laughter and the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, I made a silent promise to myself. I would take the check to the bank. I would find out if it was real. And if it was, if there was even the slightest chance that Grandma had trusted me with something important, I wouldn't let her down. The humiliation and isolation still lingered, but they were joined now by something new, determination. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose, a reason to push back against the cynicism that had always surrounded me. I didn't know what I would find, or what it would mean, but I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't going to laugh this off. Not this time. That night, long after the last car had pulled away and the house had fallen silent, I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, the check resting on my knees. The laughter from earlier still echoed in my ears, but it was softer now, fading into the background like a bad dream. I turned the check over in my hands, studying every detail, the bank's logo, the date, Grandma's signature, the impossible sum written in her careful script. $5 million. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet, I couldn't let it go. I tried to imagine what my family would say if they knew I was even considering it. Mark would roll his eyes and call me gullible. My mother would sigh and tell me not to embarrass myself. Even Grandma, with her sly smile and secretive ways, might laugh and say it was all in good fun. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more here, something only I was meant to see. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Doubt gnawed at me, sharp and insistent. What if I was wrong? What if I marched into the bank and handed over the check, only to be met with pity or, worse, suspicion? What if this was just another lesson in humility, another reminder that I was always the one who believed too much, hoped too hard? But then I remembered the way Grandma had looked at me as she handed me the envelope, steady, searching, as if she was waiting for me to understand something no one else could. I remembered all the time she'd told me to trust my instincts, to listen to the quiet voice inside that everyone else seemed to ignore. "You have a good heart," she'd say, her hand warm on mine. "Don't let the world make you doubt it." I thought about all the little ways she'd shown me I mattered, even when no one else did. The locket she'd given me as a child, the afternoons spent in her garden, the stories she'd shared about her own struggles and triumphs. She'd always believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. Maybe this was her way of reminding me, one last lesson, hidden in plain sight. I sat up, the check still clutched in my hand, and made a decision. I would go to the bank. I would deposit the check. Not because I expected it to be real, but because I needed to know. I needed to prove to myself that I was willing to take a chance, to trust in something bigger than cynicism and doubt. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the house still quiet and cold. I dressed quickly, slipping the check into my wallet, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. As I drove through the empty streets, the world still wrapped in the soft gray of early morning, I replayed every conversation I'd ever had with Grandma. Her voice echoed in my mind, calm and reassuring. Sometimes, the things that seem impossible are the ones worth believing in. I pulled into the bank parking lot, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. For a moment, I sat there, staring at the building, my doubts threatening to overwhelm me. What if they laughed at me? What if they called security? What if this was all a mistake? But then I thought, what if it's real? What if Grandma trusted me for a reason? That thought was enough to get me out of the car and through the doors. The bank was nearly empty, just a few early risers waiting in line, the air filled with a faint scent of coffee and floor polish. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the counter, the check burning a hole in my pocket. The teller smiled politely, her eyes tired but kind. "How can I help you today?" I hesitated, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like to deposit this, please." I slid the check across the counter, my hands shaking. She took it, her expression unreadable as she examined it. For a moment, I was sure she would laugh, or call over her manager, or tell me it was a mistake. But instead, she nodded, typing something into her computer, her fingers moving quickly over the keys. As I waited, my mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the check would bounce. Maybe it would trigger some kind of alert. Maybe I'd walk out of here with nothing but a story to tell, a story no one would believe. But maybe, just maybe, it would be real. Maybe Grandma had trusted me for a reason. Maybe, for the first time in my life, I was about to discover that believing in something, someone, could change everything. I stood there, suspended between hope and doubt, the world holding its breath. And for the first time in a long time I felt alive. The bank was a world of quiet order, a place where everything seemed to move at a measured, predictable pace. I'd always found it oddly comforting, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, the muted conversations, the gentle clatter of keyboards. But today, every sound seemed amplified, every movement sharper, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. I watched the teller as she examined the check, her eyes flicking from the paper to her computer screen and back again. At first, her expression was neutral, the practiced mask of someone who had seen it all. She typed in the numbers, her fingers moving with the efficiency of routine. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself that this was just a formality, that any second now she would hand the check back with an apologetic smile and a gentle explanation about prank checks and family jokes. But then something changed. Her brow furrowed, just slightly, and she leaned in closer, studying the check with a new intensity. She glanced at me, her eyes searching, as if trying to gauge whether I was in on some elaborate scheme. I felt my cheeks flush, a wave of embarrassment washing over me. I wanted to explain, to tell her that I didn't really expect it to be real, that I was just following a hunch, but the words stuck in my throat. She picked up the phone, her voice low as she spoke to someone on the other end. I couldn't make out the words, but I saw the way her eyes darted back to me, the way her free hand hovered protectively over the check. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. Was this it? Was I about to be exposed as a fool, the punchline to a joke I didn't understand? A manager appeared, a tall man in a crisp suit, his expression serious but not unkind. He introduced himself, asked me to confirm my name, my address, my relationship to the account holder. I answered each question as calmly as I could, my voice trembling only slightly. He nodded, taking notes, then excused himself to make a call of his own. The minutes stretched out, each one heavier than the last. I stared at the floor, at the pattern in the carpet, at the way the sunlight slanted through the windows. I tried to remember how to breathe, how to exist in a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar and strange. I thought about Grandma, about the look in her eyes when she handed me the envelope, about the laughter of my family echoing in my mind. Finally, the manager returned, his demeanor changed. He smiled, just a little, and handed the check back to the teller. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "We'll process the deposit right away." I blinked, not sure I'd heard him correctly. It's real," I managed, my voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded. "Yes, it's real. The funds will be available in your account within the next business day." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I felt lightheaded, as if I'd stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting to fall. I looked at the teller, who was now smiling at me, her earlier suspicion replaced by something like awe. "Congratulations," she said softly, sliding a receipt across the counter. "That's quite a gift." I took the receipt, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I stared at the numbers, at the impossible sum now attached to my name. $5 million. It didn't seem real. It couldn't be real. And yet, here it was, printed in black and white, undeniable. I walked out of the bank in a daze, the world outside brighter and louder than I remembered. The sun was shining, the air crisp and cold, but I barely felt it. My mind was spinning, 1,000 questions tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. What did this mean? Why had Grandma done this? Why me, and not anyone else? I thought about calling my mother, about telling her what had happened, but the words caught in my throat. I could already hear her voice, sharp with disbelief, maybe even anger. "Don't be ridiculous," she'd say. "It's a mistake. You need to give it back." I imagined Mark's smug grin, Sarah's mocking laughter, the whole family turning on me for daring to believe in something they'd all dismissed. Should I tell anyone? Should I keep it a secret? The questions pressed in on me, heavy and insistent. I wanted to share the news, to shout it from the rooftops, but I was afraid of what it would mean, of how it would change everything. I'd spent my whole life on the outside, watching as my family closed ranks around their own stories, their own truths. Now, for the first time, I held something they didn't understand, something that set me apart in a way I'd never imagined. I drove home in silence, the check and the receipt tucked safely in my wallet. Every stoplight, every turn, felt surreal, as if I were moving through a dream. I kept expecting to wake up, to find myself back in Grandma's living room, the laughter ringing in my ears, the check nothing more than a scrap of paper. But the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, a sense of possibility blooming in my chest. What if this was real? What if Grandma had trusted me for a reason? I thought about all the times she'd told me to believe in myself, to trust my instincts, to look for the truth beneath the surface. Maybe this was her way of showing me that I was capable of more than I'd ever imagined. As I pulled into my driveway, I sat for a long moment, staring at the house I'd always thought of as temporary, a place to rest between disappointments. Now, everything felt different. The world was the same, but I was not. I had a secret, a truth that belonged to me alone, at least for now. I wondered what would happen next. Would my family find out? Would they believe me? Would they try to take it away, to claim it for themselves? Or would they dismiss it, as they always had, too blinded by their own cynicism to see what was right in front of them? I didn't have any answers. All I had was a check, a receipt, and 1,000 new questions. But for the first time in my life, I felt the stirrings of something I'd almost forgotten, hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I was meant for something more. Hope that Grandma had seen something in me worth believing in. As I sat there, the sun warming my face through the windshield, I made a silent promise to myself. I would honor Grandma's trust. I would find out why she'd chosen me, and what she wanted me to do with this gift. And no matter what happened next, I wouldn't let fear or doubt hold me back. The world was full of possibilities, and for the first time, I was ready to see where they might lead. I couldn't keep the secret to myself for long. The check had cleared, the money was real, and the world felt suddenly unsteady beneath my feet. I needed answers, needed to see Grandma, to look her in the eye and ask the questions that had been burning in my chest since the moment I left the bank. So, the morning after the deposit, I drove to her house, the old blue one with appealing shutters and the wild rose bushes tangled along the fence. The same house where I'd spent so many afternoons as a child, learning to bake bread and plant seeds, listening to her stories as the sun slanted through the kitchen window. She was waiting for me, as if she'd known I would come. She sat at the kitchen table, a mug of tea steaming in front of her, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The room was warm and familiar, filled with the scent of cinnamon and the faint, earthy smell of potting soil. I hesitated in the doorway, suddenly unsure of what to say. She looked up and smiled, her eyes bright and knowing. "Come in, sweetheart. Sit down. You look like you've seen a ghost." I sat across from her, the checkbook in my pocket feeling heavier than ever. For a moment, I just looked at her, at the lines etched deep around her eyes, the silver hair pulled back in its usual bun, the cardigan buttoned all the way to her chin. She looked so small, so ordinary, and yet I knew now that there was so much more to her than met the eye. "I went to the bank," I said quietly. "The check, it cleared. It's real." She nodded, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Of course it is." I shook my head, still struggling to believe it. "Grandma, how? Why would you do something like this?" She took a sip of her tea, her hands steady. "I suppose it's time you knew the truth. You see, people have always underestimated me. They see an old woman in a faded sweater, living in a house that could use a new coat of paint, and they think they know everything there is to know. But life has a way of surprising you, if you let it." She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window. "When I was a girl, I didn't have much. My parents worked hard, but there was never enough to go around. I learned early on that if I wanted something, I'd have to find a way to get it myself. So I did. I started small, babysitting, selling vegetables from the garden, mending clothes for the neighbors. Every penny I earned, I saved. And when I was old enough, I took a job at the local factory, working double shifts to put myself through night school." Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, but I could hear the steel beneath it, the quiet determination that had carried her through a lifetime of challenges. "I studied accounting. Numbers always made sense to me, even when nothing else did. After a few years, I started helping people with their taxes, their budgets, their small businesses. I invested what I could, always careful, always patient. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And over time, it grew." She smiled, a little wistfully. "No one ever noticed. Your grandfather, God rest his soul, was a good man, but he never understood money. He let me handle it, and I did. I made sure we had enough, and then some. When he passed, I kept going. I bought a few properties, invested in a few companies. Nothing flashy, nothing risky. Just slow, steady growth. And now, here we are." I stared at her, stunned. I'd always known Grandma was smart, but I'd never imagined this. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" She shrugged, a small, graceful gesture. "People see what they want to see. If I'd told them, they wouldn't have believed me. Or worse, they would have tried to take it. I wanted to make sure it went to the right people, for the right reasons." I thought of my family, of the laughter and disbelief, the way they dismissed her gift as a joke. "Is that why you gave everyone those checks? To see what we'd do?" She nodded, her eyes sharp. "I wanted to see who would believe, who would trust me, even when it seemed impossible. Most of them. Well, you saw how they reacted. But you've always listened. You've always believed in me, even when no one else did." A lump rose in my throat. I didn't want to make a fool of myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that you meant it. That there was something you wanted me to see. She reached across the table and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. I wanted you to see that you're capable of more than you think. That you don't have to let other people's doubts define you. I wanted you to know that sometimes, the world gives you a gift, and it's up to you to decide what to do with it. Tears pricked at my eyes. I don't know what to do, Grandma. I don't know if I deserve this. She squeezed my hand, her eyes gentle. Deserve has nothing to do with it. Life isn't fair, and it never will be. But you have a good heart. You've always tried to do the right thing, even when it was hard. That's what matters. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words settling between us. I thought about all the times I doubted myself, all the times I'd let other people's opinions shape my sense of worth. I thought about the check, the money, the possibilities it represented. And for the first time, I felt something shift inside me, a sense of strength, of purpose, of trust. Thank you, I whispered. For believing in me. For trusting me. She smiled, her eyes shining. You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. Just promise me you'll use it well. That you'll remember where you came from, and who you are. I nodded, the promise settling deep in my bones. I will. I promise. As I left her house that morning, the world felt different, brighter, sharper, filled with possibility. I understood now that Grandma's strength had never been in her money, or her secrets, but in her faith, in herself, and in me. And I knew, whatever happened next, I would carry that strength with me, wherever I went. It didn't take long for the news to spread. I'd barely made it home from Grandma's when my phone started buzzing, first a text from Sarah, then a call from Mark, then a flurry of messages from numbers I didn't even recognize. At first, I tried to ignore them, hoping the storm would pass if I just kept my head down. But the messages kept coming, each one more frantic and insistent than the last. Is it true? Sarah wrote, her words sharp and hurried. Did the check actually clear? Mark's voicemail was less subtle. Hey, call me back. I heard something crazy. Don't do anything stupid, okay? By the time my mother called, her voice tight with barely contained panic, I knew there was no hiding from it. You need to come over, she said, not bothering with pleasantries. Now. I drove to my parents' house in a daze, my mind spinning with everything Grandma had told me. I tried to hold on to her words, her faith in me, but it was hard with the weight of my family's expectations pressing down on me. When I walked through the front door, I was met with a wall of faces, my parents, Mark, Sarah, Uncle Dave, Aunt Linda, even a few cousins who rarely bothered to show up for anything less than a holiday. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy and electric. No one smiled. No one offered me a seat. They just stared, waiting for me to explain myself. My mother was the first to speak. Is it true? She demanded, her eyes narrowed. Did you really deposit that check? I nodded, my throat dry. Yes. It cleared. For a moment, there was silence. Then the room erupted. Uncle Dave threw his hands in the air. This is ridiculous. Why would she give it to you? What about the rest of us? Aunt Linda's voice was shrill, her words tumbling over each other. She's always had a soft spot for you, but this is too much. It's not fair. Mark stepped forward, his jaw clenched. You have to split it. That's the only fair thing to do. Grandma meant for all of us to have it, not just you. Sarah chimed in, her tone icy. You can't seriously think you deserve all that money. You're not special. The accusations came fast and furious, jealousy, resentment, old wounds resurfacing with a vengeance. Every slight, every perceived injustice from years past was dragged into the light, twisted and magnified by the promise of money. I stood in the center of the storm, their words battering me from all sides. You're being selfish, my mother said, her voice trembling. You know how much we've all struggled. How can you keep this to yourself? I tried to explain, to tell them about my conversation with Grandma, about her reasons, her trust. But they didn't want to hear it. They only saw the money, the opportunity slipping through their fingers. Uncle Dave jabbed a finger at me. You think you're better than us? Just because you were the only one dumb enough to take her seriously. Aunt Linda shook her head, tears in her eyes. We're family. Family shares. That's what Grandma would have wanted. I wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, that they didn't know Grandma the way I did. But the words caught in my throat, choked by years of being overlooked, dismissed, ignored. I felt the old familiar ache of being the outsider, the one who never quite belonged. But beneath the hurt, something else was growing, a hard, bright core of resolve. I remembered Grandma's words, the strength in her voice as she told me to trust myself, to do what I knew was right. I thought about all the times I'd let my family's opinions shape my sense of worth, all the times I'd backed down to keep the peace. Not this time. I'm not keeping it to myself, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I'm doing what Grandma asked. She trusted me with this. She wanted me to use it well. Mark scoffed. Oh, please. She's old. She probably didn't know what she was doing. Sarah crossed her arms, her eyes cold. You're just using this as an excuse to take what isn't yours. My mother's voice softened, pleading now. Please, honey. Think about the family. Think about everything we've done for you. I looked around the room, at the faces twisted by greed and desperation, and felt a wave of sadness wash over me. This was what money did. It revealed the cracks, the fault lines that had always been there, just beneath the surface. It turned love into competition, trust into suspicion. I am thinking about the family, I said quietly. But I'm also thinking about Grandma, about what she wanted. She didn't want us to fight over this. She wanted us to remember what matters. Uncle Dave snorted. Easy for you to say, sitting on $5 million. Aunt Linda wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. You're going to regret this. You'll see. The room fell silent, the weight of their disappointment pressing down on me. I wanted to reach out, to make them understand, but I knew it was useless. They'd already made up their minds. I left the house without another word, the door closing behind me with a finality that echoed in my chest. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, the sky heavy with the promise of snow. I stood on the porch, breathing in the silence, trying to steady myself. My phone buzzed again, more messages, more demands, more accusations. I turned it off, needing a moment of peace, a moment to remember who I was and what I stood for. I thought about Grandma, about the life she'd built from nothing, about the strength she'd hidden behind her gentle smile. I thought about the trust she'd placed in me, the faith she'd shown when no one else would. And I realized that this was my test, too, not just of what I would do with the money, but of who I would become in the face of pressure and doubt. I walked to my car, my steps slow but sure. I knew the days ahead would be hard, that my family's anger and resentment wouldn't fade easily. But I also knew that I couldn't let their greed define me. I couldn't let their voices drown out my own. As I drove away, I felt a strange sense of freedom, a lightness I hadn't known in years. For the first time, I was choosing my own path, guided not by fear or obligation, but by the quiet certainty that I was doing the right thing. The betrayal stung, the accusations hurt, but they couldn't touch the core of resolve that had taken root inside me. I would honor Grandma's legacy, not just with the money, but with the choices I made, the person I became. Let them rage, let them accuse. I knew the truth. And for the first time, that was enough. That as I drove away from my family's house, their voices still echoing in my mind, I found myself reaching for something steady, something to hold onto as the world spun with accusation and anger. The road blurred past my window, but my thoughts drifted backward, searching for the moments that had shaped me, the quiet lessons Grandma had woven into my life like golden threads through a patchwork quilt. I remembered being 7 years old, kneeling in the dirt beside her garden, my hands caked with mud and my knees stained green. The other kids were inside, watching cartoons, but I'd chosen to stay with Grandma, drawn by the gentle rhythm of her work and the stories she told as she weeded and planted. That day, I'd accidentally snapped the stem of a young tomato plant, and tears sprang to my eyes, hot and ashamed. Grandma had knelt beside me, her hands gentle as she examined the damage. "It's all right, sweetheart," she'd said, her voice soft and sure. "Things break sometimes. That doesn't mean they're ruined forever." She showed me how to prop the plant up with a stick, how to tie it gently with a strip of cloth. "With a little care, it'll heal. Sometimes, the things that seem most fragile are the ones that surprise you." I'd watched that plant all summer, and by August, it was heavy with fruit, proof that even broken things could thrive. That lesson stayed with me, resurfacing now as I faced the fractured mess of my family. I thought of Grandma's hands, steady and patient, coaxing life from the soil, never giving up on anything or anyone. I wondered if she'd known, even then, that I would need that lesson most of all. Another memory surfaced, this one from my awkward teenage years, when I felt invisible at school and even more so at home. I'd come to Grandma's house in tears after a particularly cruel day, my words tumbling out in a rush of shame and frustration. She'd listened without interrupting, her eyes kind and attentive. When I finished, she'd handed me a mug of cocoa and said, "You know, people will always find reasons to look down on others. But their opinions don't define you. Only you get to decide who you are." She'd told me about her own childhood, about the neighbors who'd whispered behind her back, the teachers who'd said she'd never amount to much. "I could have let them be right," she'd said, her eyes shining with quiet defiance. "But I decided to prove them wrong, not for them, but for myself. You have to know your own worth, even when no one else sees it." That wisdom echoed in my mind now, a lifeline in the chaos. My family's anger, their jealousy and accusations, felt less like a verdict and more like noise, loud, yes, but not the truth of who I was. Grandma had taught me to measure myself by my own standards, to find value in kindness, in resilience, in the quiet strength of doing what was right even when it wasn't easy. I remembered the countless afternoons spent in her kitchen, the two of us side by side as we kneaded dough or chopped vegetables. She'd let me make mistakes, never scolding, always encouraging me to try again. "Perfection isn't the goal," she'd say, dusting flour from her hands. "It's about learning, about caring enough to do your best. That's what matters." There was the time I'd forgotten to add sugar to a batch of cookies, and I'd been mortified when the family bit into them and made faces. Grandma had simply laughed, popped one in her mouth, and declared it the best breakfast biscuit she'd ever had. "See," she'd winked. "Sometimes mistakes turn into something new. Don't be afraid to fail, darling. That's how you grow." Her lessons weren't always spoken. Sometimes they were in the way she treated others, the neighbor who lost her husband, the cashier at the grocery store who always seemed tired, the stray cat that showed up on her porch one winter. Grandma never turned anyone away. She gave what she could, even when she had little herself. "Kindness is never wasted," she'd say, pressing a warm plate into my hands to deliver next door. "You never know whose day you might change." Now, as I navigated the storm of my family's greed and disappointment, I clung to those memories. I saw the contrast so clearly, the chaos of their demands, the bitterness in their voices, set against the calm certainty of Grandma's love. She had built her life on quiet strength, on the belief that goodness mattered, even when it went unnoticed. I realized, with a sudden clarity, that this was the real inheritance she'd given me. Not the money, not the check, but the lessons she'd planted in my heart. The ability to stand firm in the face of doubt, to choose compassion over anger, to believe in my own worth even when others tried to tear it down. As I pulled into my driveway, the sun dipping low behind the trees, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The turmoil wasn't gone, my family's words still stung, and the road ahead was uncertain, but I knew I wasn't alone. I carried Grandma's wisdom with me, a quiet strength that would guide me through whatever came next. I stepped out of the car, the evening air cool against my skin, and looked up at the sky. Somewhere, I imagined, Grandma was watching, her eyes bright with pride. I whispered a silent thank you, promising to honor her lessons, not just with words, but with the choices I made, the person I continued to become. In the chaos of the present, I found my anchor in the past. And with every step forward, I carried her love, her resilience, and her unwavering belief in me. The invitation came as a text from my mother, but it might as well have been a summons. Family meeting. Grandma's house. Tonight. No explanation, no pleasantries, just a command, as if I were a child again, expected to obey without question. I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay home and let the storm rage without me. But another part, the part Grandma had nurtured, the part that had learned to stand tall even when the world tried to shrink me, knew I had to go. The sun was setting as I pulled up to Grandma's house, the sky streaked with orange and purple. The driveway was already crowded with cars, the porch light glowing like a beacon. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and walked inside. The living room was packed. My mother and father sat stiffly on the couch, my aunts and uncles clustered in tense knots, my cousins sprawled in chairs and on the floor. The air was thick with accusation, the kind of heaviness that settles before a thunderstorm. Grandma sat in her armchair, silent and watchful, her eyes following me as I entered. No one greeted me. No one smiled. All eyes turned, and for a moment, I felt the old familiar urge to shrink, to apologize for taking up space. But I remembered Grandma's hand on mine, her voice in my ear. You have to know your own worth, even when no one else sees it. I straightened my shoulders and met their gaze. My mother was the first to speak, her voice brittle. We need to talk about what's happened. About the money. Uncle Dave jumped in, his face red. This whole thing is a mess. You've put the family in an impossible position. Sarah rolled her eyes. You could have just split it. But no, you had to make it all about you. I looked around the room, at the faces twisted by anger and fear, and felt a strange calm settle over me. I'd spent my whole life trying to please these people, trying to earn their approval. But now, with Grandma's lessons echoing in my heart, I realized I didn't need it. I didn't need their permission to do what I knew was right. I know you're all upset, I said, my voice steady. I know this isn't what you expected. But I'm not going to apologize for believing in Grandma. I'm not going to apologize for trusting her, or for doing what she asked. Mark scoffed. You're just being selfish. You think you're better than us. I shook my head. No, I don't think I'm better. But I do think I'm different. I listened to Grandma. I believed in her, even when everyone else laughed. And I'm not going to let you make me feel ashamed for that. Aunt Linda's voice trembled. We're family. We're supposed to look out for each other. I turned to her, my eyes softening. I agree. But looking out for each other doesn't mean tearing someone down because they got something you wanted. It doesn't mean using guilt or anger to get your way. Grandma wanted us to remember what matters: kindness, trust, love. Not money. My father, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. You're young. You don't understand how hard life can be. That money could help all of us. I met his gaze, feeling the old ache of wanting his approval, but I didn't flinch. I do understand. I know what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to feel invisible. But I also know that money isn't going to fix what's broken between us. Only we can do that. The room erupted again, voices overlapping, accusations flying. You're ungrateful. You're tearing this family apart. Grandma's lost her mind. The noise swelled, a tidal wave of pain and fear and longing. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the storm wash over me. When I opened them, I saw Grandma watching, her eyes shining with pride and sorrow. I thought of all the times she'd told me to stand up for myself, to speak my truth even when it was hard. For the first time, I spoke my truth, and everything changed. I raised my voice, cutting through the chaos. I'm done letting you make me feel small. I'm done letting you decide what I deserve. I love this family, but I won't be manipulated or shamed into giving up what Grandma entrusted to me. I won't let your anger turn me into someone I'm not. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. You don't care about us. You never have. I shook my head, my own eyes stinging. That's not true. I care more than you know. But caring doesn't mean giving in to demands. It means doing what's right, even when it's hard. It means setting boundaries, even when it hurts. Uncle Dave slumped back in his chair, defeated. Aunt Linda wiped her eyes, her anger spent. My mother looked at me, her face softening, and for the first time, I saw something like understanding in her eyes. I know you're all hurting, I said, my voice gentler now. I know this is hard. But I can't fix it for you. I can only do my best to honor Grandma's wishes, and to be the person she believed I could be. The room was quiet now, the fight gone out of them. I felt the weight of their disappointment, but I also felt lighter, as if a burden I'd carried for years had finally been set down. Grandma spoke at last, her voice clear and strong. I chose who I chose for a reason. I wanted to see who would trust me, who would believe in something bigger than themselves. I'm proud of you, she said, looking at me. And I hope the rest of you can find it in your hearts to be proud, too. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, but it was a different kind of silence, one filled with possibility, with the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. I stood there, surrounded by my family, and felt a sense of peace I'd never known before. I had spoken my truth. I had set my boundaries. And for the first time, I knew who I was, not just the outsider, not just the quiet one, but someone strong, someone worthy, someone who could stand up for what mattered. As I left the house that night, the air was cool and clear, the stars bright above me. I knew the road ahead would still be hard, that there would be more pain, more anger, more healing to do. But I also knew that I was ready. I was no longer afraid of my own voice, no longer willing to let others define my worth. For the first time, I was free. And everything, absolutely everything, had changed. The days that followed felt strangely hollow, as if the world had been emptied of sound. My phone, once a constant source of messages and calls, now sat silent on the kitchen counter. The family group chat, usually buzzing with plans and gossip, was eerily quiet. When I passed my mother's number in my contacts, my thumb hovered, but I couldn't bring myself to call. I knew what I'd find on the other end, a wall of coldness, a voice clipped and distant, the echo of disappointment. At first, the silence was suffocating. I wandered through my small house, the rooms echoing with memories of laughter and noise. I replayed the confrontation in my mind, second-guessing every word, every moment I'd stood my ground. Was I selfish? Had I let them down? The questions circled like vultures, picking at the edges of my resolve. But as the days stretched on, something inside me began to shift. The ache of loneliness was real, but it was different from the old ache of being overlooked. This was the pain of choosing myself, of setting boundaries, of refusing to be defined by other people's expectations. It hurt, but it was clean, honest, a wound that could heal, rather than a bruise that never faded. I spent long hours walking the neighborhood, letting the cold air clear my head. I watched the world move on without me, neighbors raking leaves, children racing down the sidewalk, the mail carrier waving as she passed. Life, I realized, didn't stop just because I felt alone. The sun still rose, the wind still blew, the earth kept turning. There was a strange comfort in that, a reminder that my pain was only one small part of a much larger story. In the quiet, I found space to think, really think, about who I was and what I wanted. For so long, I'd measured myself by my family's standards, by their approval or lack of it. I'd let their voices drown out my own, let their needs eclipse my own dreams. Now, with the noise gone, I could finally hear myself. I remembered Grandma's words, the lessons she'd planted in me over the years. You have a good heart. Don't let the world make you doubt it. I repeated those words to myself like a mantra, letting them sink in, letting them become the foundation of something new. I started to see the outlines of a different life, a life where I didn't have to apologize for who I was, where I could make choices based on my own values, not out of fear or guilt. I thought about the money, about the possibilities it represented. For the first time, I let myself imagine what I could do with it, not to prove anything to my family, but to honor the trust Grandma had placed in me. The loneliness was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was joined now by something else, a sense of empowerment, of clarity. I realized that I was capable of surviving this, of building something new from the ashes of what I'd lost. I didn't need to be surrounded by people who only saw me as a means to an end. I could choose my own path, set my own course. I began to fill my days with small acts of self-care, cooking meals from scratch, reading books I'd always meant to read, tending to the plants on my windowsill. I reached out to old friends, people who knew me outside the context of family drama, and found comfort in their easy laughter, their acceptance. I volunteered at the local food bank, remembering Grandma's lesson that kindness is never wasted. Each act, no matter how small, felt like a step toward healing. There were moments when the grief threatened to overwhelm me, when I missed the easy camaraderie of family dinners, the comfort of belonging, even if it was only on the fringes. But I reminded myself that true belonging couldn't be bought or forced. It had to be built, slowly and honestly, on a foundation of respect and love. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the last light fade from the sky, I realized I was no longer afraid of being alone. The silence that had once felt like a punishment now felt like a gift, a space in which I could finally become myself. I understood, in a way I never had before, that painful growth was still growth, and that healing often began in solitude. I thought of Grandma, of her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in me. I knew she would be proud, not because I'd inherited her money, but because I'd found the courage to stand up for myself, to trust my own heart. I whispered a thank you into the darkness, feeling her presence settle around me like a warm blanket. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was no longer afraid. I was alone, yes, but I was also empowered, clear-eyed, and ready to take the first steps toward a life that was truly my own. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of hope, not the fragile hope of a child longing for acceptance, but the steady, quiet hope of someone who had learned to accept themselves. And in that hope, I found the strength to begin again. The first time I sat down to truly consider what to do with the money, I felt the weight of it settle over me like a heavy, invisible cloak. $5 million. It was a number so large it barely felt real. A sum that could change a life or many lives forever. For days, I let the possibilities swirl in my mind, each one colored by Grandma's voice, her lessons, her unwavering belief that kindness and purpose mattered more than anything money could buy. I started small, almost timidly, as if testing the water. I made a list of the things I'd always dreamed of doing but had never dared to pursue. Some were simple: take a painting class, travel to the places Grandma had told me about in her stories, finally fix up my little house so it felt like a home. Others were bigger, bolder, dreams I'd tucked away for so long they felt almost impossible to name. But as I wrote, I kept coming back to the same thought: what would Grandma do? She'd lived her life quietly, never seeking attention, always finding ways to help others without fanfare. She taught me that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touched, the good you left behind. So I started looking for ways to honor her legacy. I reached out to the local community center, the one where Grandma had volunteered for years, and asked what they needed most. The director, a kind woman named Mrs. Patel, was stunned when I offered to fund a new after-school program for kids who needed a safe place to go. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "She always said you had a generous heart." I found myself drawn to projects that reflected Grandma's values: quiet, steady acts of kindness that made a real difference. I donated to the food bank, set up a scholarship fund for students who reminded me of myself, and paid off the medical bills of a neighbor who'd been struggling in silence. Each act felt like a stitch in a new tapestry, one woven from hope and healing rather than old wounds. But it wasn't just about giving money away. For the first time, I allowed myself to dream for me, too. I signed up for that painting class, my hands trembling with excitement and nerves as I dipped my brush into bright, bold colors. I booked a ticket to Ireland, the land of Grandma's ancestors, and stood on windswept cliffs, feeling the salt air on my face and the vastness of the world open before me. I started to see myself not as the outsider, but as someone with a place in the world, someone worthy of joy, of adventure, of new beginnings. As I stepped into this new life, I found that opportunities and relationships began to bloom in unexpected places. At the community center, I met people who saw me for who I was, not for what I could give them. There was a young teacher named Alex, whose laughter was infectious and whose kindness reminded me of Grandma. We spent long afternoons planning programs for the kids, sharing stories over coffee, and slowly, a friendship blossomed into something deeper, something that felt like the start of a new chapter. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd lost touch with in the years I'd spent trying to fit into a family that never quite made room for me. They welcomed me back without judgment, their warmth a balm to the old wounds I still carried. I realized that family could be chosen, built from the people who truly cared, who celebrated my growth instead of resenting it. There were still moments when the past tugged at me, when I heard a song that reminded me of childhood Christmases, or when I passed my mother in the grocery store and she looked away, her face closed and unreadable. The pain of those old wounds hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined me. I could acknowledge the hurt, honor it, and then let it go, making space for something new. One afternoon, as I sat in my newly painted kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows, I found myself thinking of Grandma. I imagined her sitting across from me, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes crinkling with pride. I wished I could tell her about everything I'd done, about the lives I'd touched, about the way her lessons had shaped every choice I made. But maybe, in some way, she already knew. Maybe she'd always known that I was capable of more than I believed, that I could turn pain into purpose, loneliness into connection, fear into hope. I realized then that this was the true gift she'd given me, not just the money, but the freedom to become myself, to build a life rooted in kindness, courage, and love. The old wounds were still there, faint scars beneath the surface, but they no longer held me back. They were part of my story, but not the whole of it. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself looking forward instead of back. I made plans, set goals, dreamed bigger than I ever had before. I knew there would be setbacks, moments of doubt and loneliness, but I also knew I had the strength to face them. I had learned, at last, to trust myself, to believe that I was worthy of happiness, of purpose, of a life that felt truly my own. And so, with Grandma's blessing echoing in my heart, I stepped into the world with open hands and an open heart, ready to build something new. I was no longer defined by old wounds, but by the new beginnings I chose every day. And in that choice, I found a sense of peace and fulfillment I had never known before. It happened on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day when the sky hangs low and the world feels small and close. I was at the community center, helping Alex set up for the after-school art program, when my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me, some old, stubborn thread of hope, made me answer. It was Sarah. Her voice was thin and shaky, nothing like the sharp, confident cousin I remembered. Can you come to the hospital? She asked, barely above a whisper. It's Mom. She had a heart attack. The words hit me like a stone to the chest. I dropped everything and rushed to the hospital, my mind racing with memories and regrets. Aunt Linda had always been the most emotional of the family, her love fierce and sometimes overwhelming. I remembered her hugs, her laughter, the way she'd cried at every graduation and birthday. I also remembered her anger, her accusations, the way she'd looked at me the last time we spoke, hurt and betrayed. When I arrived, the waiting room was crowded with family. Mark sat with his head in his hands, his bravado stripped away. My mother stood by the window, staring out at the rain, her face drawn and pale. Sarah rushed to me, her eyes red-rimmed. She's stable, she said, relief and exhaustion mingling in her voice. But it was close. Too close. For a moment, no one spoke. The old tension was there, but it was softer now, worn down by fear and worry. I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to apologize for being there, but I pushed it aside. I was different now. Stronger. I took a seat beside Sarah, offering her my hand. She squeezed it, her grip desperate. Hours passed in a blur of hospital smells and hushed voices. When the doctor finally came out to tell us Aunt Linda would recover, the relief was palpable. Tears flowed freely, and for the first time in months, I saw my family as they truly were, flawed, frightened, and deeply human. Afterward, as we sat together in the cafeteria, the conversation turned, inevitably, to everything that had happened. Mark was the first to break the silence. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough. For everything. For how I acted. I was angry, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with tears. We all did. We let the money get in the way. We forgot what mattered. My mother looked at me, her expression softening. I was so hurt, so scared of losing you. I thought if I pushed hard enough, you'd come back. But I see now that I was wrong. I'm sorry. The words I'd longed to hear for so long washed over me, bittersweet and healing. I felt the old wounds ache, but I also felt them begin to close. I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. I forgive you, I said, my voice steady. All of you. I know how hard this has been. I know how much we've all lost. But I also know that we can choose something different. We can choose to heal. There was a long silence, broken only by the hum of the vending machines. Then Mark spoke again, his voice tentative. Do you think we can start over? Be a family again? I looked around the table, at the faces I'd known all my life, and felt a surge of hope. I think we can try. But it has to be different this time. We have to be honest with ourselves and with each other. We have to respect each other's boundaries. Sarah nodded. I want that. I want us to be better. My mother reached for my hand, her touch hesitant. I want to know you. The real you. Not just the version I thought you should be. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I didn't look away. I want that too. But I need you to understand, I'm not the same person I was. I've changed. I have boundaries now. I have dreams. I need you to respect that. They all nodded, the weight of understanding settling over us. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale. But it was real. In the weeks that followed, we began the slow, careful work of rebuilding. It wasn't easy. Old habits died hard, and there were moments when tempers flared, when the past threatened to pull us back into old patterns. But each time, we tried again. We talked, really talked, about our fears, our hopes, our regrets. We listened, even when it was hard. I invited them to see the community center, to meet the kids whose lives had been changed by Grandma's legacy. I showed them the scholarship fund, the garden I'd helped plant in her honor, the art projects that filled the halls with color and laughter. Slowly, they began to understand, not just what I'd done with the money, but why I'd done it. They saw the values Grandma had instilled in me, the lessons she'd passed down through quiet acts of love. One afternoon, as we walked through the garden together, my mother stopped and turned to me. I'm proud of you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I see now what Grandma saw. You're strong. You're kind. You're exactly who you're meant to be. I hugged her, feeling the last of the old pain melt away. Thank you, Mom. That means everything. Mark and Sarah found their own ways to reconnect. Mark started volunteering at the center, coaching the kids' soccer team and discovering a patience he never knew he had. Sarah helped organize a fundraiser, her sharp wit and organizational skills finally put to good use. We laughed together, shared meals, and slowly, the walls between us began to crumble. There were setbacks, of course. There were days when the old resentments flared, when someone said something careless or hurtful. But each time, we came back to the table, willing to try again. We learned to apologize, to forgive, to let go of the need to be right. Through it all, Grandma was our guiding star. Her memory was everywhere, in the garden, in the laughter of the children, in the quiet moments of understanding that bloomed between us. We talked about her often, sharing stories and memories, letting her wisdom guide us as we built something new. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, I gathered my family together. We stood in a circle, hands joined, and I spoke from the heart. We've been through so much, I said. We've hurt each other, and we've healed. We've lost, and we've found our way back. I know we'll never be perfect, but I believe in us. I believe we can be a family, not because we have to, but because we choose to. Tears glistened in my mother's eyes. Mark squeezed my hand. Sarah smiled, her face soft and open. In that moment, I felt the full weight of forgiveness, not just for them but for myself. I let go of the old wounds, the old stories, and made room for something new. I saw my family not as the source of my pain, but as fellow travelers on the road to healing. We stood together as the sky faded to twilight, the garden blooming around us, and I knew that Grandma was with us, her love woven into every leaf and petal. I felt her pride, her joy, her unshakable faith in the power of forgiveness. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and fear. But we faced them together, stronger for all we had endured. We had found our way back to each other, not through money or obligation, but through compassion, honesty, and the willingness to begin again. As I looked at my family, I saw not just the people I'd grown up with, but the people we were becoming, braver, kinder, more open to love. I saw the possibility of a new family dynamic, one built on trust and respect, on the lessons Grandma had taught us all. And in that possibility, I found hope. Hope for healing, for forgiveness, for a future where we could be both whole and together. Hope that, no matter how far we wandered, we could always find our way home. The call came on a quiet morning, the kind where sunlight slants through the kitchen window and the world feels gentle, almost forgiving. I knew, even before I answered, what the news would be. Grandma had been slowing down for months, her steps smaller, her voice softer, but her spirit had never dimmed. Still, nothing truly prepares you for goodbye. Sarah's voice was gentle. She passed in her sleep, peaceful. The nurse said she was smiling. I thanked her, my own voice steady, though my hands trembled as I set down the phone. The house was silent, the only sound the ticking of the old clock Grandma had given me years ago. I let the grief come, not as a wave but as a tide, slow, steady, filling every corner of my heart. The days that followed were a blur of arrangements and memories. Family gathered, this time not in anger or accusation, but in shared sorrow and gratitude. We sorted through Grandma's things together, each object a story, each photograph a window into the life she'd lived. There were tears, of course, but also laughter, at her old recipes scribbled in the margins of cookbooks, at the faded notes she'd tucked into drawers, at the way she'd managed to keep every birthday card any of us had ever given her. At the memorial, the community center was filled to bursting. People came from all corners of her life, neighbors, friends, children she'd mentored, families she'd helped. They spoke of her kindness, her quiet strength, her ability to make everyone feel seen. I listened, my heart swelling with pride and loss, realizing just how far her legacy reached. After the service, as the sun set over the garden we'd planted in her honor, my family gathered one last time in her living room. The air was thick with memory, but also with something new, a sense of peace, of understanding. My mother found a letter, sealed and addressed to me, tucked inside Grandma's favorite book. She handed it to me with a small, sad smile. I opened it with trembling hands, the familiar script bringing tears to my eyes before I'd even read a word. "My dearest," it began, "if you're reading this, it means my journey here is done. Don't be sad for me. I've lived a long, full life, and I've loved every moment I spent with you. I want you to know how proud I am, not for what you've done with the money, but for who you've become. You've shown courage, kindness, and the strength to stand on your own. That's all I ever wanted for you." She went on, her words weaving together the lessons she'd spent a lifetime teaching me. Wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the love you give and receive, in the lives you touch, in the courage to be yourself even when it's hard. I gave you that check not to test you, but to remind you that you are capable of more than you know. I wanted you to see yourself the way I see you, brave, generous, and worthy of every good thing. I read the letter aloud to my family, my voice breaking and mending with each line. When I finished, there was silence, but it was a gentle silence, filled with understanding. We sat together, holding hands, letting the weight of her words settle over us. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on the journey we'd all taken. I thought of the pain and the anger, the loneliness and the fear, but also of the healing, the forgiveness, the new beginnings. I saw how far we'd come, not just as individuals, but as a family. We were still imperfect, still learning, but we were together, bound not by obligation, but by choice. I spent more time at the community center, pouring my energy into the programs Grandma had inspired. I watched as children learned to paint, to read, to believe in themselves. I saw the ripple effect of her kindness, the way one life could touch so many others. I realized that this was the true meaning of legacy, not the money, not the possessions, but the love and resilience you leave behind. One afternoon, as I walked through the garden, I found myself talking to Grandma, telling her about the new projects, the friendships I'd made, the ways our family was healing. I felt her presence in the warmth of the sun, in the laughter of the children, in the quiet strength that had become my own. I finally understood what Grandma wanted us to learn. She wanted us to see that wealth was never about what you could hold in your hands, but about what you could hold in your heart. She wanted us to know that love, once given, never truly leaves, that it grows, multiplies, and endures, long after we're gone. As the seasons changed and the garden bloomed, I carried her lessons with me. I forgave myself for the years I'd spent doubting, for the times I'd let fear or anger guide me. I forgave my family, too, understanding now that we were all just doing our best, all just trying to find our way. I kept Grandma's letter in a drawer by my bed, reading it whenever I needed a reminder of who I was, and who I could become. I made a promise to honor her legacy, not just with words, but with actions, with kindness, with the courage to keep growing. In the end, Grandma's greatest gift wasn't the money, or even the lessons she taught. It was the love she gave so freely, the belief she had in me, the way she showed me that even the most ordinary life could be extraordinary if lived with purpose and heart. As I stood in the garden one evening, the sky painted with the colors of sunset, I felt a deep, abiding peace. I knew that I would carry Grandma with me always, in every act of kindness, in every moment of courage, in every choice to love and forgive. Her legacy was alive, not just in me, but in everyone she'd touched. And as I looked to the future, I knew that I was ready to pass it on, to become, in my own way, the kind of person she had always believed I could be. I finally understood what Grandma wanted us to learn, that love is the only true wealth, and that a life lived with kindness and courage is the greatest legacy of all. It's strange how a single moment, a slip of paper, a laugh at Christmas, a quiet decision to believe, can change the entire course of a life. When I look back now, it's almost hard to remember the person I was before that day. I see myself standing on the edge of the living room, check in hand, surrounded by laughter that wasn't meant for me. I remember the sting of being the outsider, the ache of wanting to belong, the fear that I would always be invisible. But I also remember the spark of hope, the quiet voice inside that refused to be silenced. The voice that said, "What if it's real? What if you matter?" That voice, so small at first, grew louder with every step I took, every risk, every act of faith, every time I chose to trust myself instead of the doubts and dismissals of others. The journey from that moment to this one was not a straight line. It was a winding path, full of sharp turns and steep climbs, moments of despair and flashes of joy. There were days when I questioned everything, when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear, when the old wounds threatened to pull me back into the shadows. But there were also days of light, days when I saw the world with new eyes, when I felt the warmth of connection, when I realized that I was not alone. I learned that family is not just the people you're born to, but the people who choose you, who stand by you, who see you for who you truly are. I learned that forgiveness is not a single act, but a practice, a choice you make again and again, for yourself and for others. I learned that boundaries are not walls, but bridges, ways to protect your heart while still reaching out in love. Most of all, I learned that self-worth is not something you earn by pleasing others, but something you discover by listening to your own heart. It's the quiet certainty that you are enough, just as you are, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. There are still moments when the old doubts creep in, when I hear my mother's voice in my head, or see the flicker of resentment in a cousin's eyes. But now, I meet those moments with compassion, for myself and for them. I know that we are all carrying our own burdens, all trying to find our way. I know that I can choose how I respond, that I can choose kindness, even when it's hard. The money changed my life, yes, but not in the ways I expected. It gave me freedom, yes, but it also gave me responsibility. It allowed me to help others, to build something lasting, to honor Grandma's legacy in ways that mattered. But the real transformation was inside me. The real gift was the courage to believe in myself, to trust my instincts, to step into the world with open hands and an open heart. I think often of Grandma, of the lessons she taught me in her quiet, steady way. I see her in the garden, her hands deep in the earth, her eyes bright with laughter. I hear her voice in the wind, in the laughter of children, in the gentle encouragement I offer to others. She taught me that resilience is not about never breaking, but about learning to grow stronger in the broken places. She taught me that kindness is never wasted, that every act of love ripples outward in ways we may never see. As I look to the future, I carry those lessons with me. I know there will be more challenges, more moments of doubt and fear. But I also know that I have the strength to face them, that I am not defined by my past, but by the choices I make every day. I know that I am worthy of love, of happiness, of a life that feels true to who I am. I hope, if you're reading this, that you find your own spark of hope, your own quiet voice that refuses to be silenced. I hope you know that you are not alone, that your story matters, that you have the power to change your life in ways you can't yet imagine. I hope you find the courage to believe in yourself, even when it feels impossible. Looking back, I see now that every moment of pain, every setback, every lonely night was leading me here, to a place of peace, of purpose, of belonging. I see that the journey was never about the money, or the approval of others, but about learning to love myself, to trust myself, to stand tall in the face of doubt. Moving forward, I choose to live with intention, to give freely, to love deeply, to forgive quickly. I choose to honor the legacy of those who came before me, not by clinging to the past, but by building something new, something beautiful, something true. I choose to believe that we are all capable of transformation, that we are all worthy of a second chance, that we are all, in our own way, extraordinary. So here's what I know now, after everything: you are enough. You are worthy. You are stronger than you think. And the courage to believe in yourself is the greatest gift you can ever give or receive. As I step into the next chapter of my life, I do so with gratitude, for the lessons, for the love, for the chance to begin again. I carry Grandma's wisdom in my heart, a light that will never go out. And if I could leave you with one thing, it would be this: no matter where you come from, no matter what you've been through, you have the power to write your own story. You have the power to choose hope, to choose kindness, to choose yourself. Because in the end, the greatest legacy we leave is not in what we have, but in who we become. And I am finally, beautifully becoming myself.